United States.
For democracy belongs to us all.
A government for our tomorrows.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
We gather because we have chosen hope over fear.
Because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you.
Meet this moment as the United States of America.
Hello, welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Leanne Caldwell, anchor Washington Post Live, and also co-author of the Early Brief newsletter. Today, we have such an important conversation with Congressman Khanna, a Democrat from California, who is also a surrogate to President Biden. Congressman Khanna, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Leanne. Great to be on.
Great to have you. So you just participated in a very long meeting among House Democrats, a closed meeting where you all discussed President Biden and whether he should remain as the Democratic nominee. What was the takeaway from that meeting?
Well, Leanne, look, I never discuss confidential caucus meetings, never have in my years in Congress, but let me give you the take of what I think is the temperature of colleagues overall. The reality is that the president has said that he is running. He is the only person who has the votes to make that decision. And I think there is an increasing consensus that we need to now focus on making the case against Donald Trump, making the case against the extreme policies of Project 2025, and unify to win with the assumption that he is the nominee.
What is the mood like in the caucus right now? The party has mostly been united for, as you guys are in the minority, trying to maintain the presidency and win back the House. What's the mood right now?
The mood is one of a fighting spirit. Most people who are in Congress have overcome odds where they've been down. Very few people haven't had a loss. I lost twice before I won. We know that you can make a difference through a campaign. Most people believe that the president is an underdog at this point, but an underdog who clearly has a path to victory, and that the key to that victory is to drive the economic contrast with Donald Trump, to talk about what we're going to do for working families, to talk about increasing wages, to talk about Donald Trump and Project 2025's plan to cut Social Security, to cut Medicare, to have a federal national ban on abortion, to fire civilian employees. We need to really let the American people know what the contrast is.
There seems, I've talked to a lot of Democrats over the past 10, 11, 12 days, and the mood has seemed to shifted. Right now, today, even last night, there seems to be a resignation among Democrats who think that perhaps President Biden should not be run for re-election, that the cement is drying, that is going to be the case, and they're just going to have to deal with the best case scenario. So is that an accurate depiction that there is a resignation among Democrats that Biden will stay on the ticket?
I wouldn't describe it as a resignation. What I would say is fair to say is that there were differences of opinion on that issue within the caucus. And it's clear now that the president is intent on running, that he has talked to people close to him. He's not going to listen to a young member of Congress like me or many young members of Congress. He's going to listen to his family, to senior advisors, maybe people who have served with him for decades. It's a very small group of people. And he's made the decision to run, and that everyone in the caucus believes that whoever our nominee is, we have to get behind them. So, and almost everyone believes that there's a path to victory. Now, are there some people in the caucus who thought that there could have been an alternative ticket? Sure. But I wouldn't describe them as resigned. I would just describe them as recognizing that their first alternative didn't come to pass, and now they're fully committed to making sure that the president defeats Donald Trump.
Do you think that the president can defeat Donald Trump?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, the polls, even if you look at the worst polls, show the race within 5-6 points. And we know historically that margin can be made up in a convention. That margin can be made up as more people pay attention. The other thing that I think when you look at the polls, it shows that the president's support right now is in the low 70s with African American voters, the not that high with Latino voters. I think many of those voters will come back to the president. I don't think that Donald Trump is going to get over 20% of the African American vote. So my view is that there is a path to victory. I think we have to be clear-eyed that the president is an underdog. I think that there needs to be a change in the campaign and the campaign's approach. They need to stop declaring a war on the media. You know, Napoleon once said that having 4 hostile newspapers is worse than having an army of people with 1,000 bayonets. I wish someone were to share that quote with the president's team. I don't understand why they're declaring this war on the media. But, you know, Donald Trump can do that because he's got a conservative media infrastructure. We can't. So we've got to put the president out there, put the president out in town halls, put the president out in conversations, and we need to all make the case against Donald Trump and Project 2025.
Speaking of polls, you brought up polls. There's a new poll out this morning from AARP in Wisconsin, which pre-debate had been one of the president's better states among the 6 or 7 battleground states. It shows President Biden down 12 points. Now, granted, that includes third-party candidates. When you take the third-party candidates out of it, he's still down 5 points behind President Trump. Is that concerning?
Well, look, it's not a great poll. I've seen other polls. Someone just texted me a poll this morning, which they'll put out saying that the president is down 1 nationally to Donald Trump. So I think the polls are in a range where the president is an underdog. But I don't believe he's down 12 points, or that is a sustainable lead for Donald Trump. Maybe there was a temporary dip. I think the president's numbers there will recover. And probably he's down a few points in these battleground states from the aggregate data that I've seen. But I think that there has to be a recognition that we are in a tough campaign where we're the underdog, and we're going to have to fight to come from behind and win, and that we need a change of course, that we can't just continue with what we're doing.
Democrats, as we've been talking about, have been concerned. There's been a lot of division among elected Democrats anyway. A lot of discontent from donors about President Biden. It seems like, how do you get past this? If Biden continues to stay as the nominee, stays on the ticket, runs for re-election, how do Democrats stop being concerned, and how does President Biden prove to those who are concerned that he will be able to run for or be president for another 4 years?
I think he needs to say, I understand people's concerns. These are not illegitimate concerns. These are not people who are bedwetters. I get it. If people are concerned at the age of 81, whether I'm fit to be president, whether I'm going to be fit 2, 3, 4 years from now. But I'll tell you one thing, Donald Trump is not fit to be president. He's not fit to take away rights from women. He's not fit to lead this country in taking away rights from immigrants. He's not fit to lead this country in giving handouts to the very wealthy. And I will tell you that I am far more fit to lead the United States than Donald Trump. And that's the choice between us. Do I deny that I have aged? Of course not. Am I the same person I was 4 years ago? No. No one who's 81 is the same person they were at 77. And life is unpredictable. But here's what I know. Come November, I'm far more the fit person to lead America than Donald Trump. And that I think has to be our argument.
Do you think that if President Biden does step aside, that the party would unite behind Kamala Harris, the vice president?
I believe that Joe Biden is going to be our nominee. I think the rest of it is sort of a West Wing episode, which is unlikely to happen. It makes for great entertainment, but isn't going to come to pass. I will say that the vice president enjoys a lot of respect in the caucus. I've known her for years, being a Californian representative, and I have full confidence that she also could win and beat Donald Trump, and that she would do very well. But the point is that that's not the scenario that's going to come to pass in 2024.
Your governor, California Governor Gavin Newsom, his name has been thrown around about a potential presidential candidate. This time, if President Biden does step aside, and in the future, has he contacted you at all about running this year should President Biden step aside?
No, he has not, and I would be shocked if he didn't defer to Vice President Harris, who is the sitting vice president in California. And I have not. I mean, I have a cordial relationship with Governor Newsom, but I have not seen him make any moves at all to try to displace President Biden or to upstage Vice President Harris.
I want to ask you something about progressives. You have been on the campaign trail advocating for President Biden, but acknowledging that there's a lot of concern in the party about the handling of the war in Israel and Gaza. Um, there's a lot of progressives who have come out in strong support of President Biden, including Representative Ilhan Omar, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Um, Despite the fact that there is some frustration with him on the handling of Gaza, can you explain that to me? That some of his biggest supporters now, during this very perilous time for the president, who were critical of him before because of some progressive policies, are now standing with him.
Progressives tend to be values based. Many of those colleagues think it is undemocratic to have big donors or Democratic operatives dictate because of polls who should be the nominee. They remember, as do I, having some of these operatives on MSNBC and CNN saying that Bernie Sanders was unelectable. And we disliked it when they said it about Bernie Sanders, and we don't think that they should be determining the process for the Democratic Party. I think what this has shown is sort of the shallowness of some of the operatives who are guided simply by polls and by conventional views of electability. Progressives believe that if we have an agenda that speaks to the working class, if we have an agenda for raising minimum wage, for universal child care, for free public college, for giving dental, vision, and hearing for people with Medicare, for having new economic job creation, that we can win, and that it is less about personality and more about an agenda that speaks to working class and middle class folks. But I've been very proud of the discipline progressives have shown to make it about policies. And we haven't been part of the circular firing squad, even though many times progressives get blamed for Democratic underperformance.
Do you think that President Biden is going to be able to win young voters? You've been talking to college students across the country after this debate performance, and because combined with the war in Gaza.
He's got a lot of work to do. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There are a lot of people who think he gave too much of a blank check to Netanyahu. There are people who think he is too old. There are people who want new generational change. You know, when you have two presidents talking about their golf handicap and debating that, it's about as out of touch as you can get with the vast majority of this country. And there are people who say, really? That's what you're talking about when we can't afford rent, when we can't afford housing, when we don't have a clear, bold vision on climate? But here's one of the things I've seen that is resonating with young people is a fear of Project 2025. I mean, some of those policies that are anti-LGBTQ, that are for book burning, that are anti-abortion, that are blatantly anti-immigrant, like repealing birthright citizenship, saying that even if you were born in the United States, if your parents weren't citizens at the time, you wouldn't be a citizen. They are so extreme that young people understand what's at stake. And I think the more we can help young people understand Trump's actual agenda, the better shot we have of getting them on board.
Yesterday, we learned that the White House, from the White House, that a Parkinson's disease expert has evaluated Biden 3 times. Does that concern you?
What concerns me is just that there's full transparency, and it seems that the White House has been fully transparent. But what I would say is that the White House should be absolutely clear on the president's medical condition and what the issues were, why the doctor visited. I think that they have. And my understanding from the White House is that they've said that the president doesn't have any movement disorder or Parkinson's. I take them at their word. But, you know, it's very, very important that they are fully transparent.
Is there anything more that they should do to be more transparent?
It seems to me their explanation is that the president was seen 3 times, that there was a clear diagnosis that he doesn't have movement disorder or Parkinson's, that he's not on any medication and that the reason that this doctor was there other times was to treat other people on the complex. And I would just say that that better be the full picture and fully accurate, and I take them at their word. But there is no. You want to talk about losing people's support? If there were ever evidence that wasn't truthful, that's where I think you would see the dam breaking. But I take them at their word.
I have a reader or viewer question from Trey McGriff from North Carolina, which is considered a battleground state. They ask, other than asking President Biden to step down, give us 3 specific options that the Democratic Party should consider to reassure the public and maintain confidence in his leadership.
It's a great question, and that's the question I think Democrats need to be asking ourselves across the country. First, I would talk about our record of governance, that we actually reduced the unemployment rate to under 4%, that we have inflation coming down, that we've had a manufacturing renaissance in counties that were left out because of globalization, the rural communities, the deindustrialized towns. In the last 3 years, they've had more economic growth, more job creation than in the last 20 years. This was a front page story in the New York Times, and they've done far better in having a manufacturing renaissance than they did under Donald Trump. And we need to say that is the economic policy that we're going to continue. And Donald Trump is just going to give tax breaks to the very, very wealthy. Second, we need to talk about the specificity of Donald Trump's agenda with Project 2025, bans on abortion, bans on books, bans on people getting treatment, medical treatment if they're trans, discrimination against people who are LGBTQ plus or immigrants. And third, we need to show that this is a huge, talented bench of Democrats up and down the ticket, and we all need to be giving the message of contrast in our values. The Democratic Party is more than just the president. It's a collection of many, many people who are leaders, and if we all make that case to our friends, to our families, to our communities, that's our best chance of defeating Donald Trump.
Congressman, you come from a safe district. You're almost pretty much guaranteed to win your reelection, but there are a lot of Democrats who come from swing districts and who are concerned about the president's impact on their own races. So I want to ask you, do you think that Democrats will be able to win the House this year, given with the president at the top of the ticket?
I do. Hakeem Jeffries should have one line. He's the insurance policy to Donald Trump. Many of my colleagues have run ahead of the president in 2020. Many of them are running ahead of the president today. When you talk to frontliners in candor, they're mixed in whether the president is the best to carry on or not, but they're all confident that regardless of the decision the president makes, they can win their seats and that they can outperform the president. And so I believe actually that this was a wake-up call now that we see that there's a real possibility of Donald Trump returning. I don't think most people thought that until the debate. They hadn't focused in. He needs to have a check if the unthinkable happened and he won. And I still believe that the president has a very good chance of winning. But one of those checks is having Hakeem Jeffries as Speaker of the House. I served in Congress all 4 years with Donald Trump. When we had Paul Ryan as Speaker of the House, he was basically a yes for anything Donald Trump wanted. When we had Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House, Donald Trump was impeached twice and his agenda was checked. It's a world of difference.
I have another question from a viewer. Jessica Hitchin from New York State asks, what message can resonate with voters who lean toward not voting in the presidential election because they don't support either of the main party candidate? So she is talking about voter apathy and not voting at all. What is your response to that, Congressman?
My response is that the parties are what citizens make of them. I mean, who would have thought that Donald Trump would have been able to take over the entire Republican Party? Well, if he could do it, then young people on our side could take over the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders almost did. And if you care and think that the party needs to have a new generation of leaders, if you care and the party needs to have a bolder vision on affordable housing and capping extraordinary rents, if you care about Medicare for all, if you care about universal child care, then go out and vote, go out and run for office, take over the party. The challenges we face as Americans are tough, but they're nowhere near the challenges that people faced when they scaled the cliffs of Normandy to win World War II, or my late colleague John Lewis faced when he was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or my grandfather faced when he was in jail for 4 years alongside Gandhi so that India could be an independent country. We have been given an extraordinary amount of freedom and opportunity, and we need to exercise it to make this country better. Yes, we need a new generation of leaders. Yes, we need presidential candidates who aren't talking about their golf handicap, but make that happen. And that comes by being engaged in voting.
Mm-hmm. The NATO summit, the 75th anniversary of NATO, is in Washington. World leaders are celebrating in Washington this week, begins today. The president has a packed schedule. Today, tomorrow, Thursday will be a press conference. How important is it for the president to kind of knock it out of the park for this week for Democratic members of Congress?
But we've got to get past this sense that we're fixated on his every word. I mean, I imagine, Leanne, if you go and look at some of my TV interviews, and I think I do a pretty decent job, and you started to dissect my words, they don't always come out grammatical. I've looked at transcripts afterwards, and I said, wow, that didn't sound that great. So I think more important than every single sentence and does it have a subject, verb, and proper ending is what is his vision? The president needs to get beyond, okay, I'm energetic and vibrant, and say, here's what's at stake. What's at stake is, do we give 1/5 of Ukraine to Putin? That's what he wants. More of Ukrainian territory than he even currently has occupied. That is what Donald Trump is likely to agree to. Or do we want to stand for the territorial integrity of Ukraine? Do we want a new NATO plan that is robust and has American involvement in case Russia goes beyond Ukraine and threatens one of the Baltic states? Under my leadership in the next 4 years, we are committed to NATO. We're committed to Ukraine's territorial integrity and standing up to Putin. Donald Trump would compromise that integrity. I think he has to make it about what is the contrast in vision on NATO.
Great. Congressman, I know you have to run, but I really want to ask you one more thing, and it's about the
Sure.
January 6th immunity, or the immunity case at the Supreme Court that was decided last week, giving presidents immunity for official acts. How does this change the presidency? And people are very nervous about this across the country. Should people be scared?
It was a wrong decision. Look, I met with Chief Justice Roberts in the past, and I guess if I were asking Chief Justice Roberts a question, here's what I would say. You know, Justice Roberts, if there was a member of Congress who in an official act says, okay, I am going to vote for this bill for a technology because I'm getting personally $1 million from a tech donor, don't you think they should be prosecuted for bribery? And my guess is, of course, he would say they should be prosecuted. But that vote is an official act from a member of Congress. And what the Supreme Court has said is if the president takes an official act, then there is no prosecution. And I just don't understand the logic behind that. You can have deference and protection for the president in terms of foreign policy judgments, deference and protection in terms of things that we don't want prosecution based on political judgment. But you can't create total immunity for the president to do illegal things. No other branch of government has that. And so it is just a wrong decision on the face of the Constitution. And it should be concerning for Donald Trump. 99% of people who have been presidents in my lifetime, most people, I don't think would go and take that and say, okay, I'm going to do illegal things. I don't believe that about either of the President Bushes. I don't believe that about President Reagan. But with Donald Trump, you know, he's shown that the norms have no meaning for him. And this is really a concern in how far he's going to stretch the bounds of what he's going to ask the executive branch to do.
Congressman Khanna, thank you so much for your time today and spending so much time with us. Really appreciate it.
And always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. If you want to watch more of these conversations, sign up for a Washington Post subscription. And we will see you next time at washingtonpost.com/live.